Alright, hello and welcome to the first video part in the Learn module for differential reinforcement and stimulus discrimination. The objectives that we'll cover in this video part are objective number 1, define antecedent. Objective number 2, list variable features of antecedents. Number 3, you'll be able to define and identify, emit, elicit, and evoke, and identify and discriminate between examples of those terms. Then you'll define abate, and then you'll identify the correct use of the terms emit, elicit, evoke, and abate in scenarios describing the effects of antecedents on behavior. Lastly, you'll classify abative and evocative effects as dimension-altering effects. Objective number 1 is define antecedent. An antecedent is a stimulus, operation, or condition that precedes a response in time. Antecedents occasion operant behavior. That is, antecedents guide operant behavior. So sometimes you'll see or you'll hear antecedents referred to as setting the occasion for the behavior to occur. That's a way it's talked about. Occasioning the behaviors is you'll see that in textbooks. Guiding the operant behavior is less common terminology, but you'll see that sometimes too. It's also useful. And just note that an antecedent can be a stimulus, an operation, or a condition. What's important is that this is a stimulus, that is a change in the environment that can affect an organism's behavior through their receptors, that precedes a response in time. In the unit on behavior and environment, we talked about how stimuli can be classified based on either structurally, temporally, or based on function. So calling a stimulus an antecedent is a temporal classification. We're specifying that this stimulus, operation, or condition occurs before the behavior occurs, and in fact it sets the occasion for that behavior to occur and can guide it. So you've been introduced to the four-term contingency, MO, S, RS, and both the MO and the first S in this four-term contingency are antecedents. MOs and other antecedents have different effects on behavior. Let's look at some examples of antecedents. The first one is that the light turned on and the rat pressed the lever. So the light turning on was antecedent to the rat pressing the lever. It occurred in time before the rat pressed the lever and guided or set the occasion for lever pressing. Later on, we'll say the light turning on evoked lever pressing. Another example, the smoke alarm sounded and the people ran out of the building. If we're technical, we will say that only individuals engage in behavior, so technically this is not an antecedent with respect to behavior if we say the people ran out of the building. So we can revise it and say the man or the woman ran out of the building or the person ran out of the building. So there's an individual who can engage in behavior, and what preceded that behavior was the smoke alarm sounding. So that's the antecedent stimulus that evoked or occasioned or guided behavior. Another example, the phone rang and you answered it. So you answering the phone is the behavior. What immediately preceded that behavior was the antecedent of a phone ringing. Phone rang and that evoked or occasioned answering the phone. Your blind date put their arm around your shoulder and you cringed. Cringing is the behavior here, and the blind date putting their arm around your shoulder would be the antecedent that evoked or occasioned that behavior. The juice from the cantaloupe touched your tongue and you took a bite of the fruit. So taking a bite of the fruit is the behavior. The antecedent that evoked it was juice on the tongue. You smelled the scent of the air freshener and felt relaxed. Okay, the feeling of being relaxed is the behavior here. And smelling the scent of the air freshener, or that is the smell or the odor of the air freshener, is the antecedent that evoked your feelings of being relaxed. Much time passed since the teacher called on the student. Then the student raised her hand to answer a question. So notice that the behavior here is the student raising her hand to answer a question, and the antecedent is time passed. So, well, how does that differ from the other antecedents? Notice that all the other antecedents are things that you can see, so a light, or hear, the alarm sounding or the phone ring, or feel, the blind date putting their arm around your shoulder, taste, the juice in the cantaloupe, smell, the scent of the air freshener. Here we have time passed, and the passage of time can't be sensed. You cannot observe time passing. You can notice that digits on a digital watch have changed, or the hands on a clock have moved. So they're indicators of the passage of time, but you can't sense that. So it's important to note that sometimes antecedents are, in a sense, invisible. You can't see them. The researcher entered the room, and the participants lowered their voices. Okay, so let's be more specific. We have one participant lowering their voice. The researcher entered the room. That's the antecedent that this time abated. I've used the word evoke so far, but I'm going to say abate. Abate means to momentarily decrease. We're going to talk about that later, but in this case, the researcher entered the room. That's the antecedent with respect to the participant lowering their voice. There may be an ulcer in your stomach, and that evokes curling into a fetal position. So curling into a fetal position is the behavior what preceded. This is an antecedent, but this antecedent is a private stimulus this time. Right? So stimuli that were in the external environment were light on, alarm sounded, phone rang, and so forth. This particular stimulus is a private stimulus. Here are some non-examples of antecedents. When the rat pressed the lever, the food pellet was dispensed. So the behavior is lever pressing. It produced a food pellet. A food pellet was added to the environment when the rat pressed the lever. It occurred after, or was the result of pressing the lever, so it's a consequence, not an antecedent. That's how we would temporally classify that stimulus. It occurs after lever pressing. When the people exited the building, they avoided asphyxiation or smoke inhalation. All right, so let's say we have one person. They exited the building. The consequence is that they weren't asphyxiated by the smoke in the building that, let's say, is on fire or something. So avoidance is a consequence, not an antecedent. When you answered the phone, your best friend was on the other line, and they're talking to you. So answering the phone is the behavior. The consequence is your phone on the other, friends on the other line talking to you. And then, let's say when you cringed, your date said, "My bad." So before, when your blind date put their arm around your shoulder and you cringed, the blind date putting their arm around your shoulder was the antecedent. The consequence of you cringing is your date said, "My bad." That's a non-example of antecedent because my bad here is a consequence for you cringing. Okay, so let's look at our first ASR here, or our first poll. The student turned the faucet on and water came out. In relation to turning the faucet on, faucet off was A, the antecedent, or B, the consequence. Now for this presentation, poll everywhere won't work, so go ahead and write down your answer. This is ASR number 1. And then later you're going to transfer your ASR answers into the test for this learn module. Alright, give you a couple more seconds. Alright, and the answer is antecedent. The student turned the faucet on and the water came out. In relation to turning the faucet on, faucet off was the antecedent because the faucet was off, it set the occasion for or evoked reaching and turning the faucet on. After you jumped from the plane in your parachute, you pulled the ripcord and the parachute opened. In relation to pulling the ripcord, the opened parachute was A, an antecedent, or B, a consequence. Couple more seconds. Alright, and the answer is C, B, a consequence. After you jumped from the plane in your parachute, you pulled the ripcord, the parachute opened. So it's asking you in relation to pulling the ripcord. That's the behavior, not jumping from the plane, but pulling the ripcord. And it says the opened parachute. Well, that was a result of pulling the ripcord, so we would call that a consequence. Alright. So now let's talk about operant selection. We've talked about operant selection before, but we're going to look at it in a little bit different way. Organisms come to any given context or situation with a genetic background, a learning history, right? And they're in a current environment. And so the current environment and genetics and learning history influence variability in the organism's behavior. They're going to vary their behavior topographically or vary their behavior across stimuli. And those variations of behavior interact with the environment to produce immediate consequences. And those immediate consequences result in differential retention, in that some topographies will contact consequences that increase the future probability the behavior will occur, and some produce consequences that decrease the future probability the behavior will occur. The increase is what we call reinforcement, and the decrease is what we call punishment. So that results in differential retention of certain variations of the organism's behavior in their overall behavioral repertoire. Other terms for differential retention are differential reproduction, replication, a strengthening of the behavior. If it's punishment, we say a weakening of the behavior. We can say increased future probability the behavior will repeat or vary, or decrease the future probability that the behavior will repeat or vary. And this is based on Donahoe 1999, Skinner 1981. These repeated cycles of variation, selection, and differential retention result in complex behavior. So we've talked about operant selection before like this, and as we did now, we focused on how the consequences in the environment select variations in behavior. But operant selection also affects the functions of antecedent stimuli. So antecedent stimuli can be selected by the environment as well. So consider an organism engaging in some behavior freely. This is free operant behavior. They can engage in the behavior across a wide variety of antecedents, stimuli, contexts, different environments. Okay, so depending on the environment, there's going to be variation in the stimuli, context, or conditions or setting in which the behavior occurs. Okay. Now, the behavior is going to produce consequences, right? And consequences select some responses to repeat in the future in the presence of a stimulus. Some consequences select the behavior to not repeat or decrease or weaken or decrease in probability in the future in the presence of a particular stimulus. Okay? In the presence of some stimuli, this free operant behavior is not going to produce a reinforcer or a punisher. So there's those various conditions. And as a result of operant selection of behavior under certain conditions or in the presence or absence of certain stimuli, the functions of those stimuli are altered. Okay, so you have a response producing a consequence in the presence or absence of a stimulus. And what can happen is that the presence of the stimulus, or the particular stimulus that's correlated with the availability of a consequence for a given behavior, becomes an SD. And in the antecedent stimulus correlated with the unavailability of the consequence, typically produced by the behavior, becomes something called an S delta. So S delta is a stimulus in the presence of which, if the response occurs, it won't produce the consequence. And from this point on, let's focus on reinforcement. All right, so the S delta is an extinction condition. That means it's correlated with the unavailability of the reinforcer for the behavior. However, a different stimulus is correlated with the availability of the reinforcer for the behavior. This is an SD. All right, and sometimes a particular stimulus is an SD and its mere absence is an S delta. Sometimes it works that way. And so the presence and absence of various discriminative stimuli and S deltas influence variability in a behavior across stimuli. In other words, operant selection determines how antecedent stimuli control behavior or variations of behavior through the relation between the antecedent stimulus and the consequence produced by the behavior. This process results in discriminated operant behavior. So free operant behavior undergoes differential reinforcement or differential punishment. The result is discriminated operant behavior. That's a general overview. We're going to get into more detail in all of this. But let me give you an example. So earlier in the course, we talked about, or I gave you an example of mom in the kitchen with her kid in a cookie jar. And we talked about that scenario in the context of operant selection. And here's how it went. It was in week 1, the child engaged in a variety of topographies: hitting, yelling, asking with words, pointing, reaching, climbing, pulling the adult's hand. The words in bold were the ones that were most likely to produce access to cookies. Mom would give cookies for those topographies. Now in week 2, you can see that variation is, there's a little bit less variation here. Climbing is gone. And these other ones in bold, now they produce cookies. In week 3, reaching is gone now, pulling the adult's hand is gone, and asking with words is gone. So now the child hits, yells, and points, and varies between them, but yelling is the most reliable, most reliably produces cookies. And that continues to be the case in week 4 and week 5, and what you can see is that cookies, as a reinforcer through operant selection, have selected yelling to be the most probable topography. And so a behavior analyst steps in and trains mom to withhold cookies for yelling and only give cookies if the child asks with words. And so in week 6, as a result of only giving cookies for asking with words and withholding cookies for yelling, yelling has been replaced with asking for words. Now, notice here that we're introducing dad. So that was mom. Okay. So now we're to dad. Dad's different. When hitting, yelling, pointing, asking with words, so on and so forth, when those occur, excuse me, they do not produce access to cookies. And I know I have these in bold here, so try to disregard the fact that I bolded these. Okay, so pretend these are not in bold. None of these topographies in week 1 result in access to cookies. Dad just says he has to wait for dinner. If he finishes his dinner, then maybe he can have cookies, something like that. But these topographies are not producing access to cookies. Same thing in week 2, week 3, week 4. Notice what happens, okay? The patterns of behavior are the form of the behavior is kind of similar to what's happening with mom, except as of week 5, the child stops asking for cookies. None of the cookie getting behavior occurs in the presence of dad. Well, that's because dad is withholding the reinforcer. Dad's using extinction. So dad is now an antecedent that's correlated with the unavailability of cookies for the behavior of asking for cookies, or any of these other topographies. So dad is now an S delta for positive reinforcement here. Okay. And now mom is an SD for positive reinforcement. And that's a result of operant selection. There were different consequences that produced this outcome, right? In the presence of mom, these topographies produced access to cookies. In the presence of dad, none of those topographies produced access to cookies. So as a result, dad is now an S delta, which abates asking for cookies, and mom is an SD, which evokes asking for cookies. We're going to, just throwing those terms out, we're going to talk about them going forward here. Okay, so objective number 2 is to list variable features of antecedents. So let's take a look. Antecedents may increase the current probability of behavior. The emphasis here is on current. We're not talking about consequences anymore. Consequences alter the future probability of behavior. But antecedents alter the current probability of behavior, the here and now. What the organism or the person is going to do at this very moment is influenced by antecedents. Antecedents may decrease the current probability of behavior. So they may increase or decrease depending on, in part, any functional relations between the antecedent and consequences. But what's important for now is that you recognize that antecedents can increase or decrease the current probability of behavior. They may have no effect on the current probability of behavior. Antecedents may be correlated with the availability of a consequence. They may be correlated with the value or the effectiveness of a consequence. Earlier when I reintroduced the 4-term contingency, MO, S, R, S, I mentioned that the MO and the first S are antecedents and that they have different effects on behavior or different functions. This first one here may be correlated with the availability of a consequence. That's a possibility for the first S in the 4-term contingency. Motivating operations, or MOs, are correlated with the value or the effectiveness of a consequence. Those are different types of antecedents. They may have multiple effects on behavior. Alright, so a given antecedent stimulus may increase or decrease the current probability of behavior with respect to operant behavior, but also it may have an eliciting effect on reflex responses. They may have different effects on different dimensional quantities of behavior. So the same antecedent may momentarily increase the rate of a behavior and momentarily decrease the duration of the behavior. They may be operant or respondent. In other words, some antecedents evoke or abate or increase or decrease the current probability that a behavior which is affected by consequences will occur. And then some antecedents reliably and consistently evoke reflex responses. In other words, some antecedents elicit reflex responses. That's another way of saying they are respondent antecedent stimuli. So, antecedents may elicit or evoke. Respondent antecedents elicit. Operant antecedents evoke. They may be auditory, visual, olfactory, cutaneous, or sensory. They may be vestibular. They may be proprioceptive. They may occur outside the skin, or inside or within the skin, as Skinner distinguished. So in other words, the antecedent may be in the external environment, or it may be a private stimulus, which is a type of private event. They may be undetectable by the senses, for example, the passage of time. Okay. Next, define and identify emit, elicit, and evoke. Identify and discriminate between examples. So, elicit, we're going to define that first. It means to reliably and consistently evoke a reflex response. Some of this is going to be familiar to you, but we're going to review it here because we're going to compare these examples of these terms a little bit more closely. Use elicit only to refer to the effects of antecedent stimuli and reflex responses. Consequences do not elicit. All right, so we don't use the word elicit to refer to the effects of consequences. An eliciting stimulus evokes a reflex response once, making measurement of frequencies meaningless. In other words, it makes no sense to measure the rate or the frequency of behavior that is elicited. The frequency of reflex responses is equivalent to the frequency of eliciting stimuli presented. In other words, if we're talking about lemon juice as an elicitor of salivation, or let's take an eye blink, which is easier to visualize. Let's say there's a puff of air to the eye and it elicits a blink, right? Each puff of air is going to elicit one blink response. Presenting a puff of air is not going to elicit 3, 4, 5 blink responses. It's a one-to-one. There's a one-to-one relationship, right? So eliciting stimulus evokes a reflex response once. So it doesn't make any sense to record or measure the frequency of eye blinks because it's dependent on the number of times you present the stimulus. This is a crucial difference between emit and elicit. I'm going to talk about that going forward here. So an important difference between emit and elicit. We're going to talk about evoke and then emit. But the difference between emit and elicit is that a response can be emitted multiple times in the presence of various antecedent stimuli, whereas an elicit, a reflex response is only elicited once per occurrence of the eliciting stimulus. Evoke. Evoke is to temporarily increase an aspect of behavior. Use evoke only to refer to the effects of antecedent stimuli on operant behavior. So when we say evoke, it means to momentarily, at this time, increase some aspect of the behavior, some dimensional quantity of the behavior. or perhaps an increase in the intensity or magnitude or severity of the behavior. Consequences do not evoke, so we can't use the word evoke to refer to the effects of consequences on behavior. The effects of consequences on behavior are reinforcement and punishment. Never use evoke to refer to the effects of antecedents that elicit reflex responses. Evoke is used to refer to the effects of antecedents on behavior selected by consequences. To evoke is a dimension-altering effect. In other words, you can, by evoke, an antecedent stimulus is momentarily increasing either a duration or a rate or latency or increasing IRT or some other dimensional quantity, right? So to evoke is a dimension-altering effect. Multiple responses may be evoked by a single stimulus. To emit is to engage in an instance of behavior which either A, is not under strong control of any antecedent, or B, the antecedent has not yet been identified by the observer. Alright, so we have three terms: elicit, evoke, and emit. Elicit can only be used to refer to reflex responses, or respondent behavior, and only one response occurs each time you present an eliciting stimulus. Evoke and emit are terms used to refer to operant behavior. Evoke is when an antecedent momentarily increases some aspect of that behavior. It has to be operant behavior only. When a behavior is emitted, it's operant behavior, and it's either it occurs under the control of a variety of antecedent stimuli, or the antecedent has not been identified by the observer. Never use emit to refer to respondent stimuli or behavior. And emit is only used to refer to behavior that's selected by consequences. To emit is to engage in the behavior independent of the number of presentations of any particular antecedent stimulus. This is a crucial difference between elicit and emit. So, for example, as a result of the passage of time since you last had a meal, let's say 4 hours passed since you had a meal, you will begin to become more likely to emit food-seeking behavior. You're going to go to the kitchen, open the refrigerator, maybe get a cup or a plate or a bowl, and because all of these behaviors ultimately are going to produce access to food. Okay, because in the past, those behaviors ultimately produce access to food. And so the passage of time is the antecedent, in this case, under which the organism or the person emits those behaviors. And so, of course, they can emit any number or variety of those behaviors under such condition. That's not the case with elicit. Right? Elicit, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Present a stimulus, one reflex response occurs. Crucial difference between emit and elicit. Alright. So in behavior analysis, the accurate use of the terms elicit, evoke, and emit depend on the relative strength of the SR relation, the strength of the RS relation, and the strength of the SRS relation. So in other words, the strength or the extent to which an antecedent controls the behavior, a consequence controls the behavior, or the behavior is controlled by the combination of an antecedent and a consequence. So let's take a look at this diagram here, which I hope conveys some of these relations. So notice at the bottom of this figure we have elicit, emit, and evoke. As you go from left to right, let's say you are more likely to use the word emit and then more likely to use the word evoke than you are elicit. Right? So if you're all the way on the far left of this figure, you're most likely to use the word elicit to refer to the effect of an antecedent on behavior. You may start to use the word emit in describing the occurrence of the behavior as you move to the right, and as you move further right, you may start to use the word evoke to refer to the effect of the antecedent on the behavior. Now, now notice this whole column above elicit is all filled in black, and that indicates a very strong SR relation. That means the behavior is entirely controlled by an antecedent. So we would use the word elicit to refer to the effect of the antecedent on the behavior. The antecedent elicits the reflex response. But as we go to the right of this figure, the amount of the column, or the proportion of the column that is filled in black, is gradually decreasing. That indicates to you that the strength of the SR relation, or the extent to which an antecedent controls the behavior, is decreasing. And notice that the proportion of the column that's filled with dark gray, indicative of the strength of the RS relation, is increasing across the diagram. Right? So what that means is that as antecedent stimuli exert less control of the behavior and consequences exert more control over the behavior, we will start to use the word emit to refer to the occurrence of the behavior. Now notice also as we go from left to right, the light gray portion of each column is also increasing. That's indicative of the strength of the combination of antecedent and consequence control over the behavior. So when the strength of the relation of the SRS relation is high, as it is in the far right column, it's most appropriate to use the word evoke if the antecedent momentarily increases some aspect of the behavior, or increases the current probability of the behavior. Then we can use the word evoke. All right. So to summarize, it's most appropriate to use elicit when there's a very strong SR relation. It's most appropriate to use the word emit when there's a very strong or an increasingly stronger RS relation. But when the RS relation becomes a discriminated operant and comes under antecedent stimulus control, so SRS relation, then we use the term evoke. So elicit and evoke refer only to the effects of what stimuli on behavior, antecedent or consequent. Give you a few more seconds. All right. And the answer here is antecedent. Which term means reliably and consistently evoke? A, elicit, B, evoke, C, emit, D, abate. Give you a few seconds. All right, and I'll close the poll. And the answer here is elicit. Which of the following terms should you only use to refer to reflex responses? A, elicit, B, evoke, C, emit, D, abate. Give it a few seconds. All right. And the answer is A, elicit. Which term should you use to refer to the effect of a bank robber on the bank teller giving all the money to the bank robber? A, elicit, B, evoke, C, emit, or D, abate. The bank robber threatens the bank teller. The bank teller gives all the money. So what term do we use to refer to the effect of the bank robber on the bank teller's behavior? A couple more seconds. All right. The answer here is B, evoke. The bank robber threatening the bank teller momentarily increased the probability that the bank teller would give all the money. Which term should you use to refer to use singing in the shower, singing in the car, singing on your bike? A, elicit, B, evoke, C, emit, or D, abate? Give me a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. Answer is C, emit. The shower, the car, your bike are various antecedents. The behavior is occurring across a variety of antecedents. The behavior is operant, so we say emit. I asked Jimmy, who wears a uniform, drives a car with flashing lights, and enforces the law in your community? Jimmy said, a police officer. My question had what antecedent effect on Jimmy's answer? A, elicit, B, evoke, C, emit, or D, abate? Give me a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. Answer is B, evoke. Alright, this is the time in our class when we usually take a brief break, but we're going to continue. Alright, so objective number 4 is define abate. Objective number 5 is identify the correct use of the terms emit, elicit, evoke, and abate in scenarios describing the effects of antecedents on behavior, and then classify abative and evocative effects as dimension altering effects. Alright, so you've heard the term abate, and now we're going to define it. Abate is to temporarily decrease an aspect of behavior. And you use abate only to refer to the effects of antecedent stimuli on operant behavior. We use the word evoke to refer to a temporary increase or a current increase in an aspect of behavior. This is a current or momentary decrease in an aspect of behavior. Consequences do not abate. They either reinforce or punish. Never use abate to refer to the effects of antecedents that elicit reflex responses. We just use abate to refer to the effects of antecedents on operant behavior. Abate is used to refer to effects of antecedents on behavior selected by consequences. To abate is a dimension altering effect. It can momentarily decrease the rate of the behavior, a duration of the behavior, IRT, latency, so forth. Okay. There are two types of evocative effects. You can increase an aspect of an ongoing behavior. We're talking evocative again. Okay. Or you can evoke a behavior that's not occurring. So those are two types. Increase an aspect of an ongoing behavior, evoke a behavior that's not occurring. Types of abative effects. You can decrease an aspect of an ongoing behavior, or you can terminate an ongoing behavior. In other words, the behavior is happening, the antecedent occurs, and then the behavior stops. Evoke a behavior that's not occurring for an evocative effect, basically the person is not engaging in the behavior, and the antecedent occurs, it evokes the behavior. Here's some examples of evocative effects. The little girl was swinging, and I asked, how high can you go? And she started to swing higher. So asking, how high can you go, is an antecedent that evoked swinging higher. The dog was sleeping, and I whistled, and the dog jumped up and ran to me. So the dog wasn't jumping and running to me. But then I whistled, and that antecedent evoked jumping up and running to me. Examples of abative effects. The boy was crying loudly in the sand because he fell on a rock. The yard duty told the boy, "It's okay, it's just a scratch." And then he started to cry softly. So the behavior was ongoing. He was crying loudly, but then the yard duty, told him it's just a scratch, and then he started to cry softly, so that abated crying. The boy was running around the playground chasing a girl, and the yard duty said, "No running," and then he immediately stopped running. So the behavior was ongoing. The antecedent, "No running," abated the behavior. Specifically, the behavior stopped, terminated. Okay. The chef was singing in the kitchen as he cooked the food. The manager walked into the room, and then the chef lowered his voice. The antecedent effect of the manager on the chef's singing was A, it elicited a lower voice. B, it evoked a lower voice. C, it emitted a lower voice. Or D, it abated loud singing. A couple more seconds. Alright, the answer is it abated loud singing. The baby was reaching to touch the electrical outlet. Dad shouted, "No, no." The baby immediately stopped reaching, pulled his hand back, and looked at Dad. Dad saying, "No, no," had what effect on reaching for the outlet? And what effect on looking at Dad? A, punished and reinforced. B, punished and elicited. C, evoked and abated. Or D, abated and evoked. A couple more seconds. And I'll close the poll. The answer is D, abated and evoked. It momentarily decreased reaching for the outlet. It stopped the behavior actually, and then evoked looking at that. Alright, that's it for this video part. See you next time in video part number 2.